Where does this story begin? Well, it starts way further, but just to, give some context. January 20th, 1942, you had a bunch of guys getting together to discuss something very, very brutal, something evil, okay? This is the Wannsee Conference, okay? And it's led by this man named Reinhard Heydrich. And the purpose of this meeting is to basically coordinate the systemic murder of up to 11 million Jewish people across Europe. Now, it's interesting to look at this guy as a psychological case study. He's evil, but he doesn't fit into the traditional mold of these sort of totalitarian despots, right? He's disciplined and he's cultured. He would play the violin. He was a brilliant musical mind, but simultaneously one of the most evil architects of this genocide. It's strange to see both at the same time, to have this intellect, but also this extraordinary cruelty. And this is ultimately the story of how someone with, ostensibly a good family background that had good schooling can turn into one of the most evil people of this war. So to understand how this man got to where he ultimately went, we got to go all the way back to the beginning. And we got to start in a small town known as Halle, Germany, in March 7th, 1904, when Reinhard Tristan Eugene Heydrich was born. His father, Richard Bruno Heydrich, was actually an accomplished opera singer and the founder and the director of the Halle Conservatory of Music, Theater, and Teaching. His mother, Elizabeth, was a pianist and a music teacher with a Catholic background, and music profoundly shaped Heydrich's early life, and he showed real talent on the violin with the potential of actually following his father into the arts. But even in this seemingly ideal upbringing, there was some trouble. Although he was not necessarily of Jewish descent, there were rumors that Richard Heydrich, his father, had Jewish ancestry stemming from the fact that his stepfather, Robert Gustav Suess, appeared to have a Jewish-sounding surname. And in the early 20th century in Germany, these whispers could affect their entire family's reputation. So Reinhard felt the stigma keenly. At school, his classmates would mock him. They would call him Isi, a stereotypical Jewish nickname. One cruel day, the boys forced him to recite anti-Semitic slogans to basically prove his loyalty to Germany. And these humiliations left a lasting mark and kind of hardened him and fueled this desperate need to prove that he was, racially pure. What's striking is how his early trauma really shaped his psychology. Rather than developing empathy for other outsiders because he himself was being treated as an outsider, he seemed to internalize a desperate need to prove his German card and, his credentials to anyone beyond any doubt. He became obsessed with demonstrating this racial purity and ideological commitment to what it means to be an actual German, as if he could maybe erase those childhood rumors or the, bullying that he received as a kid. So after finishing school, Heydrich enlisted in the German Navy in 1922, aiming to rebuild his family's honor through military service, that maybe this is the way that he could prove that he was a true German. He was a promising young officer. He was specializing in signals and communication. But even here, his personal life showed a troubling pattern. In 1930, he became engaged to Lena von Osten, a committed Nazi. But before marrying her, he fathered a child with another woman. And the Navy took a very bad view, obviously, on officers who dishonored young women, refusing to marry the pregnant woman and break his engagement. Heydrich was court-martialed and dismissed from the Navy in April of 1931, basically ending his naval career at 27 years old during Germany's economic crisis. It was Lena who suggested that he try this new branch of the government called the SS. Yes, that SS. And Heinrich Himmler was building his personal army and needed intelligent officers. But the early SS was still a relatively small organization with fewer than 3,000 men in 1931, operating in the shadow of Ernst Röhm's massive SA. Obviously, the SA is the Sturmabteilung, which is basically the large, often unruly Nazi party paramilitary force known for, street violence and, rallies and things like that. In contrast, the Schutzstaffel, the SS led by Heinrich Himmler, was smaller and more elite kind of unit envisioned as this racially pure guard and intelligence agency. And so Himmler sought to transform the SS into this elite racial sort of aristocracy of these ideological sort of guardians to the Nazi party. So in June 1931, Heydrich walked into Himmler's office for what he thought was an interview for a standard SS position, and instead, Himmler tasked him to design an intelligence service from scratch. Heydrich had no experience in intelligence work, but he did have a sharp analytical mind that could help him draft an organizational structure for the SD. Now, the SD at the time was basically an intelligence organization, kind of a sister organization to the Gestapo. Now, Himmler saw in Heydrich not just intelligence, but the vision to basically separate the SS from the crude tactics of this SA sort of paramilitary force. Now, Heydrich's loyalty and his competence and his dependency on Himmler made him the ideal choice to build the Nazi Party's first professional intelligence network. Now, what impressed Heinrich Himmler wasn't just that Heydrich improvised this sort of organizational chart, but his understanding that the SS needed to differentiate itself from the sort of, street fighting tactics of the SA. He was, this cultured, intelligent officer who grasped the importance of information and the need for secrecy. And more crucially, Heydrich wasn't burdened by the personal loyalties and sort of like interfactional disputes that hampered, older Nazi veterans. Himmler could trust him precisely because he was new and young and ambitious and really dependent on Himmler for advancement. So Heydrich was hired immediately, and within months, he was building the Nazi Party's intelligence network. And really quickly, Heydrich started to rise through the SS and was just relentless. And in 1932, just 1 year after joining, he had basically been promoted to a major in the SS and was effectively running the entire security service. Now, what made him so valuable to Himmler wasn't just his organizational skills, but just the lack of moral hesitation. So this SD that he was developing was, starting small, with Heydrich working out of a tiny apartment in Munich with just a handful of assistants. And he understood something that others were overlooking, that in a totalitarian state, information is power. So he compiled a list of anyone who might threaten the Nazi regime, and that included socialists and communists and intellectuals, church leaders, and even kept files on fellow Nazis that they believed had sympathies to these other groups. Internal rivals could be just as dangerous, if not more dangerous, than external enemies. By 1933, when Hitler actually becomes chancellor, Heydrich had built this intelligence network that reached into basically every corner of German society. He had informants inside the universities and the labor unions and the churches and even rival political factions. And the SD wasn't just gathering information, it was creating a climate of fear where no one could really trust anyone else completely. Now, Heydrich's real test came in 1934 with the Night of the Long Knives. Ernst Röhm, the head of the Brown Shirts and one of Hitler's earliest supporters, had gotten too powerful. He wanted to replace the German army's leadership with his own men, and that alarmed both the military and the conservative elites whose support Hitler needed. To keep their loyalty and prove that he was in control, Hitler decided that Röhm had to go. The problem was that Röhm commanded nearly 3 million Brown Shirt members. And this is where Heydrich proved his worth as, more than just an intelligence chief. He showed that he could orchestrate a mass murder with chilling precision. Working with Himmler and the SS chief Hermann Göring, he compiled lists of all of the leaders under Röhm and all the political enemies far beyond Röhm's inner circle, and basically marked for elimination anyone that was seen as a threat to Nazi consolidation and to Hitler himself. And then on the night of June 30th, 1934, SS and Gestapo units arrested hundreds across Germany. And thanks to, Heydrich's intelligence, execution squads knew exactly where they were going to find their targets, and they acted swiftly. And really, in this case, the efficiency is the scariest part. In less than 48 hours, between 150 and 300 people were murdered, including Ernst Röhm himself. The purge decapitated the entire brown shirt sort of SA paramilitary troop and really intimidated any type of opposition and just fully secured Hitler's power.